Welcome to the SR Insider podcast, First Call. I'm Heyrick, CEO of SRM. I'm the host for this new podcast series where we'll be discussing the big issues facing business leaders today. With me today, I have Gala Riani, who's the head of our strategic intelligence practice, who's kindly agreed to chat about emerging risks. Hi, Gala.
Hi, Heyrick. Thanks for having me.
It's all right. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. So we're about a month in, or just over a month into 2024, and it looks as if the year is going to be as hectic as last year's. But I'd love to just hear a little about some of the sort of themes that you're seeing coming out already this year.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you feel, Herrick, but it certainly feels like it's been one of the longest Januaries that I can remember. And that's not just because it's dark over here in London, but I think it reflects just some of the intensity of what we're seeing on, especially the geopolitical scene
Yeah.
globally. And a lot of those sort of trends that are coming in are continuing from 2023, right? But obviously we had war breakout in the Middle East in 2023, and that has continued, and we're still asking questions around sort of what those regional implications could be and how far-ranging they could be. The war has also had a wider impact, obviously, on the global economy in terms of the disruption to shipping and so on. So there's a lot going on. And of course, we have, all of this happening against the backdrop of a massive election year in 2024 that we've been talking a lot about and are tracking quite closely.
And when you think about those elections, would it be fair to say that the US elections are going to dominate a lot of the thinking, and the reason around that is because it's a bit of a distraction for the US, and therefore, by implication, provides opportunities for other actors around the world to take advantage of that distraction?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the US elections, one of the things that is unique about it to an extent, it doesn't just happen in the US, but it's such a long election season, right? You start with the primary. I mean, it's almost a year long, if it probably starts even before that. And it's so intense. And I think this is an especially contentious election year, right? You've got Biden and Trump head to head again. And obviously, the last round of that ended very contentiously. So you've got all of this additional, let's say, fuel on the fire. And so, and there is a sense that this is a really, really critical election for the US domestically. So absolutely, I think that there's going to be huge amounts of focus on that. And, one of the things that, you and I have talked about quite a lot over the last several weeks and months is this idea of sort of how disinformation is spread and so on. And I think it's really interesting to think about which countries are better prepared for that and which are not, right? So which countries are a bit more vulnerable in terms of how much their elections could be influenced by or disrupted by disinformation or cyber campaigns or, state actors trying to sort of interfere. And I think there's a sense that the US is probably not as well prepared as it could be if you compare to some of its sort of European allies that have been working quite hard on sort of getting themselves prepared to spot some of these campaigns and do something about them. So certainly, I think that there is, that there's a lot going on, and it's such a critical election that you can expect the US to be quite introverted for a certain period of time.
Yeah, and therefore providing an opportunity for others to flex their muscles. I think one of the things when we look at the elections and the ability for externals to influence the outcome, it's probably those elections where there's either compulsory voting, so you get a high electoral turnout, or those where there is a generally higher electoral turnout, where there's obviously more chance for the floating voters to be influenced. Do you have a feel for the jurisdictions that are likely to fall into those categories?
Well, I mean, I think, in a way, you could look at it from the other perspective, which is which are the countries that are better prepared, and that's one of the reasons why I sort of flagged the US. I think when you look at any lessons that we may or may not have learned since 2016 and Brexit and that sort of initial US election where there was just so much that came out in terms of foreign interference, you either have the lessons that are learned on a state level in some countries, so Sweden, Finland, so France, these are some of the countries that have done quite a lot to prepare themselves, and then you have the ones that have done less. But I think one of the really interesting pieces about this is also what happens on the social media platforms, because they have a huge role to play. And you have elections in 40 countries, right? But if you look at a lot of the content moderation that happens on social media platforms, primarily in English. So do you have this perfect storm where you've got all of these elections in so many different countries? We know that electoral events or generally major political events will increase that level of online chatter, disinformation. Now you've got all the deep fakes and so on. Is this a bit of a perfect storm whereby actually on a non-state level, you've got a reduction in and potentially also the capacity of dealing with these things, non-focus on non-English language content, and then all of these events taking place. So I do think that really we need to be taking each of these elections, really looking at them one by one. So if I was someone who had an interest in X country in their elections, it's really important not to just look at the bigger picture, but really take each election on its own basis and try to understand where the vulnerabilities are.
Yeah. And so that obviously then has an impact on businesses, particularly those with extended supply chains. And I think, what are the sorts of things that you've seen companies asking for when they're trying to get a handle on the sorts of things they should be thinking about in terms of the climate that we see, the geopolitical climate that we see happening or unfurling over the next 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really challenging for businesses because geopolitical risk is something that's been on the agenda for a long time, but I think probably hasn't received the adequate resourcing within a lot of organizations that it needs. So there's a sense that the world is moving very, very quickly and very fast, but sort of where do you start? And I think a lot of clients that we speak to need help with that. Where do you start point? Especially if, as you say, the supply chain is complex, especially if the tentacles are wide and long. But there are ways of doing it, right? I think there are different methods that can be used. I think, first of all, understanding where your pain points are is a really, really important first step. Because once you've mapped that, actually you can systematically look at the world and not predict everything that will happen that will affect those pain points, right? But you can prepare. And I think that's the message that, I know you and I both speak to clients about, which is there's so much going on. There's no point in trying to predict every single outcome of every single political event or geopolitical event, but you can prepare. You can do those tabletop exercises. You can conduct long-term horizon scanning so that you have those early warning indicators of where a risk may appear. And so I think, you might not be able to track absolutely everything, but you'll be in a much, much better position than if you just take your hands off the ball.
I think one of the big themes that we've seen coming through is certainly around exactly that. Clients are now working out what's absolutely critical to them from a business perspective, and then thinking pretty hard about how they can see any potential problems that are coming along, which is back to your point on horizon scanning, and then tying that in with some scenarios and that, and what they're going to do if those various things do happen. And whether that's planning for a cyber attack, I know that from the data that we've seen out of the 500 or so instances that we responded to in the last 12 months, if you plan and you practice and rehearse, there's around a 40% improvement on your business interruption costs. So it can make a massive difference. And I think one of the challenges that the teams that look at the geopolitical piece within our corporate clients has always been is, well, this is interesting, but what's the value to the business? But if you put it into the context of, as I just have, what they can help a business solve for, it becomes a very different conversation. And I think we'll see a bit more of that over the next 12 months as well. Are there, finally, before we wrap up, are there any other themes that you're thinking through, or types of requests that you're seeing from corporate clients?
Yeah, so I mean, going back to that theme of taking each individual sort of election for what it is, I think you have that, and then you have some of those elections that are going to have a much greater sort of geopolitical impact over 2024. So some of the ones that are likely to be more contentious, let's say, and that we should sort of keep an eye out for. Pakistan has elections in the next day or so. I think that's going to be really, really interesting to watch, and not just for the election itself, but sort of how it pans out down the line. So you have a case of sort of musical chairs there with the leadership, with the opposition leader Imran Khan now being jailed, whereas Nawaz Sharif, who not too long ago was jailed, is now sort of the leading candidate. So that's going to be a really important election, I think. I think Venezuela is going to be really, really interesting, because also you've had a rollback of sanctions there, which from the US, which have been hinged on the political process. There doesn't seem to be a lot of will on the side of Maduro to actually forward that political process in the way that it should. Senegal has just postponed elections in a fashion that could trigger a constitutional crisis and potentially a year of a certain amount of political unrest and so on. So you have those, and then you have the big ones. The US going to have significant geopolitical implications if Trump wins, certainly. And then, as you said earlier, there's going to be a year of certain amount of distraction. India is a really, really big one, right? Even though we don't think we're going to see any surprises there in terms of outcome, but the emboldenment of Modi will have implications for the wider region and the wider world. So it's all of those things that I think we're tracking, and it's really important to continue to look at. And then not just what the immediate implications are in terms of policy and so on, but what are the secondary implications down the line as well.
Brilliant. Sounds like a fun year ahead. Gala, thank you so much. It's been brilliant to chat to you. I know you'll be back on to this, but thank you for being the first on this podcast. And I look forward to any feedback from anyone who's listening to this, and I'm very happy to answer questions or direct them into Gala and her team. We do want SRM to be your first call. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Heyrick.